War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy was first published as a book in 1869 in Russia. This huge novel, if it really is a novel, chronicles the French invasion of Russia during the Napoleonic era in 1805 and then the years that follow immediately after. A lot of writers and a lot of readers consider War and Peace the greatest novel of all time, but Tolstoy himself didn't like to even call it a novel. Now, my opinion is that a novel can have many different forms, and the more I read fiction, the more firmly I hold on to that opinion. War and Peace is partially a historical novel, part realist novel in the best 19th century tradition, and part epic. Out of those three, I think my favorite is definitely the realist novel. So that means that I didn't love all parts of War and Peace equally, and I'll get into that in a moment. But I will say that War and Peace is probably also one of the strangest books I have ever read, and I feel like my reading experience went through different phases as Mr. Tolstoy decided to focus on the love lives of aristocratic characters, then on epic battles, then on fictionalized accounts of people like Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I, and then offer us his philosophical insights on how the study of history should be approached. I own this edition by Oxford World's Classics, translated from Russian to English by Louise and Aylmer Maud, and revised by Amy Mandelker. There are, of course, many other translations and editions available, and you will find information about those in the description of this video. Tolstoy wrote War and Peace between 1863 and 1869. The book changed as he wrote it, but the original idea was to write a book of fiction set during the time of Napoleon in Russia. The original title of this book was supposed to be 1805, which is the year when most of the novel is set, but he later changed it to War and Peace. Russian readers first encountered this novel in serial form between 1865 and 1867. That means that they had a couple of years to make their way through all of this. It took me less than that, thankfully, to read it myself, and later I'll tell you how I approached it and give you some reading tips which I think some of you might find useful. This edition I own, and I imagine other editions would be similar in this as well, has the novel structured into 4 books and then an epilogue. Not all the books that make up the novel are of equal length though. Book 1 has 3 parts, Book 2 5, Book 3 has 3 parts, Book 4 has 4 parts, and the epilogue is made up of 2 parts. Each part, in turn, is made up of several short chapters, typically between 2 and 30 odd chapters. Okay, so that makes it easier to read, more manageable. So let's look at one book at a time. So the novel famously opens at a party given by an aristocrat in St. Petersburg. Most, if not all, the main characters attend this party, so Tolstoy has them being introduced to each other. And that's how we readers get to learn who all the main players in the novel. From the start, we know that this novel is going to deal with a very specific section of the Russian society of the period, namely the aristocracy, which is also, not coincidentally, the class to which Leo Tolstoy belonged. So he's really depicting, and in some ways also criticizing, the generation or generations that had preceded him immediately. And I say this because Tolstoy was born in 1828, so just over 20 years after the short-lived French invasion of Russia that he depicts in the novel. Tolstoy was also an aristocrat who inherited the title of Count from his father. And actually, there is someone named Count Tolstoy in War and Peace, but he is only a minor character. But going back to book 1, I was at first overwhelmed by the sheer number of characters that are introduced in the first few pages of the novel. I was so overwhelmed, in fact, that I had to make a cheat sheet for myself with the names of the characters organized by family. And then I wrote 1 or 2 defining characteristics next to each of the names as a reminder of who everyone was. I felt I needed something like that to refer to every time a character showed up again and again. But I'm glad to say that my early impression was wrong, and I ended up forgetting about that cheat sheet that I had made. So if you feel like you are going to be put off by the number of characters and feel a bit overwhelmed when you start reading this novel, please don't give up. Keep reading because it soon becomes a lot easier. And you will remember who the main characters are as the action, both on the battlefields and in the society salons, gets going, okay? War and Peace is not a difficult novel. I would even go as far as to say that it is one of the easiest novels that I have read. Why? Because the style is so concise. Tolstoy gets to the point. There aren't long descriptions. The prose is clear and the narrative is easy to follow once you get over that initial hurdle when Tolstoy introduces so many characters one right after another. Now in book one, among other characters, we meet Pierre. Who is this Pierre? Well, he's the illegitimate son of Count Besukhov. He has mainly lived in the West, in Europe, and is now back in Russia, and he's trying to find his place in society, but that's really difficult for him. Another main character is Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, who is a friend of Pierre's. Andrei is married to a socialite named Lisa, but he's not happy with married life and finds his wife to be, let's say, shallow and uninspiring, to be kind. Well, Andrei finds women in general uninteresting, and he is quite a misogynistic character. So he decides that he needs more excitement in his life and a bigger purpose instead of just being married to this woman. So he tells Pierre that night that he will join the war effort against Napoleon. And this is interesting because Andrei, like most Russian aristocrats of that time, was a Francophile. He loves French culture, and he personally also nurtured a great admiration for Napoleon. Because since the time of Catherine the Great, French had actually become the language of the Russian aristocracy. And we see that in this novel to the extent that some of the Russian upper crust didn't even speak very good Russian as depicted in this novel. Tolstoy, in fact, writes some of the dialogue in French, and it is interesting to see when the Russian characters speak French to each other and when they speak in Russian. In this edition, luckily, the French sections are left in French, so we can see the difference. And of course, there are notes with a translation. And the bulk of the novel, which is originally written in Russian, of course, has been translated into English, okay? Still, in book one, the action moves then from St. Petersburg to Moscow, where we meet the Rostov family. Count and Countess Rostov have 4 children, including Natasha, who will later become one of the main characters in the novel. But at this early point, Natasha is only a girl, and I think she's like 13 years old. The action then moves back and forth between St. Petersburg and Moscow. And I think it's important to know that at that time, St. Petersburg was the capital, the new capital of the nation. And Moscow, which had been the capital before, was then considered a rather provincial city, definitely when compared to St. Petersburg. And if I read the novel correctly, I think that means that St. Petersburg was more westernized or more European, at least for the aristocracy that inhabited it. And Moscow was seen as more backward and traditionally Russian. Okay, the rest of book one is then about the preparations for battle, and then there is a fictionalized detailed chronicle of the famous Battle of Austerlitz, in which we see most of the main male characters in war action for the first time. I think the only main male character of appropriate age, of course, so not children, that does not take part in that battle is Pierre. Also, in that part of the book, we get the first cameo by Napoleon in one of the most powerful scenes of this early section of the novel, and probably the novel as a whole. If you read book one and enjoy it, you will enjoy the rest of the novel, because the rest of War and Peace, I would say, is really like that. The narrative will alternate between the realistic portrayal of high society in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other places, and then epic battles and war scenes in different parts of Central Europe, and then later in Russia, chiefly in Moscow. I think some readers will prefer the peace sections, while others will like the war sections of the novel better. From the start, I enjoyed reading about the different friendships and marriages a lot more than I did about military strategies and big battle scenes. That's why I say that my reading experience with War and Peace was uneven. I had a lot more fun reading large sections of it than I did others, and I admire how accurately and elegantly Tolstoy wrote about people, but I did find some of the war stuff, not all of it, mind, just some of it, a bit of a drudge. However you may feel about one or the other, and I guess some readers might like the whole thing just the same, and lucky you if that's the case, but if you prefer certain sections of this novel to others, I would strongly recommend you do not skip anything and just soldier on through those parts you're not enjoying, because even in the middle of something that you think you are not really enjoying so much, you are likely to find not just beautiful writing, but also some great scenes. After the Battle of Austerlitz that concludes book 1, I was relieved that book 2 begins with a return of some of the male characters home. In book 2, Natasha is now depicted as a beautiful young woman. She's no longer that girl that we had met. And I would like to call your attention here to the description of female characters throughout the novel, because often I find that what Tolstoy finds beautiful in women is not what we now think makes women beautiful necessarily. And there are some mystifying descriptions of female beauty in this novel. Also, I would say that if you are a Jane Austen fan, I think you will like book 2, because a lot of it seems to be about the relation between money and marriage, two concepts that seem to have gone together at the time, not just in England, but also in Russia, and probably in other places too. Now, one fascinating thing in this novel, to me, is how Pierre's status changes when he inherits his father's title and fortune. So he's no longer, by book 2, that awkward, illegitimate son who couldn't find his place within the Russian aristocracy. As weird as he continues to be, and he's always weird, Pierre is, he now belongs in society just because he has the money and a title, but he's still the same person. At least initially he is, because one of the best things about War and Peace is how all the major characters change throughout the narrative. We see how the war, in this case, affects them all, each one of them in different ways, and ultimately changes their lives. And Pierre may be one of the best, if not the best example of this, but he's certainly not the only character that changes greatly throughout the novel. So do Natasha and other main characters too. But to me, Pierre is a fascinating character. I wouldn't call Pierre the hero or the protagonist of War and Peace. I think War and Peace, as much as that other great novel said at the time, of course, I'm referring to Vanity Fair by Thackeray, is a novel with no hero. There is no hero or heroine in War and Peace, and that is one of the reasons that Tolstoy didn't think that this was actually a novel. For Tolstoy, his first novel was Anna Karenina, which he only wrote years later. Now, without spoiling what happens in book 2, I will say that Pierre goes through a life-changing event and becomes someone preoccupied with spirituality and morals, which prompts him, among other things, to join the Freemasons. And most of book 2 is concerned with Pierre and those internal struggles he has. So be prepared for a lot of philosophical discussion. But there is also room for romance in book 2, and that involves Natasha, Andrei, and Pierre, which is probably a love triangle that you did not see coming in book 1. Now, book 2 closes with the great comet of 1811 darting across the sky, signaling a new beginning for Pierre. By the time book 3 begins, the big confrontation between the Russian and French armies is looming. Napoleon returns as a character after his cameo in book 1, leading the army that invades Russia. And as the war gets closer to Moscow, Pierre, of all people, decides to finally join in the war effort. I have to say that book 3 is probably my least favorite out of the 4, because it deals with war so much, and I don't find reading about war that much fun personally. But because of that reason, it could be other readers' favorite part of the novel. Who knows? In book 4, then, the French finally invade Moscow, but not before the city's inhabitants have to decide whether to flee or stay and fight the French. Most people seem to abandon the city, at least the authorities do, so Napoleon's army occupy the old capital fairly easily. Pierre then takes it upon himself to assassinate Napoleon for some reason. Again, something you wouldn't have expected, or at least I didn't expect him to do based on how he's introduced in book 1. But then again, that shows you how much he's changed, how much he's changing. And his change, like that of the other main characters in the novel, is gradual, and it makes sense. Tolstoy does a great job of developing his characters through this massive tome. He definitely had enough pages to do that, right? I enjoy those scenes depicting life in Moscow under military occupation, and the role that Pierre plays in this book book 4, which keeps us tense for pages and pages. And even for me, I have to say that book 4 was quite thrilling. I think the way Tolstoy also portrays an occupied city is moving and has echoes in every war that has happened since then. You can think of any war, ongoing or in the last 100 or 200 years. And I am sure the experiences that Tolstoy chronicles here are true to life in the most heart-rending manner. The 4th book, however, ends on a positive note with the end of the war and the beginning of the rebuilding of Moscow. And there is even a marriage and a traditional happy ending. Of course, I will not tell you who gets married because I think knowing that before you read the book could spoil part of your reading experience, and I wouldn't want to do that to anybody. After book 4, there is an epilogue, which is made up of 2 relatively short parts. Now, the first part of the epilogue ties everything up nicely and gives us a glance into married life. So instead of finishing his novel with a wedding, Tolstoy takes us beyond that and shows us what the characters' married lives are like in the years following the war, and I thought that was very nice. The second part of the epilogue, however, is a lot drier. If you want to know how Tolstoy felt about history and how history is studied, should be studied, written and thought about, the second part of the epilogue sums up his critique of history as it was approached in the late 1800s. You might find this part of the novel fascinating, the second part of the epilogue, or you might find it incredibly boring, but I think it illuminates why Tolstoy wrote War and Peace the way he did and what his intentions and decisions were based on. To me, the second part of the epilogue could be read as a standalone essay almost, although, it is part of the novel as he intended it. However, if you care about the life of the characters, if that's all you care about, that's over after the first part of the epilogue. The second epilogue can be interesting also because Tolstoy's view of history, while now probably quite old-fashioned, is fascinating. Tolstoy to me is a writer who has opinions, and you don't read his work to agree with him necessarily. I think most readers would argue with Tolstoy if given a chance. Without doubt, he wrote about his ideas beautifully, and that's so much pleasurable to read. Now, if you haven't read War and Peace yet, I think it is a good idea to have a reading plan before you tackle it because it is a very long novel. It is still manageable. It is very manageable. War and Peace is not nearly as long as, let's say, In Search of Lost Time by Proust, for example. So there is no reason why you couldn't read this novel in a few weeks even if you tried. We are now in December and I started reading War and Peace in late August, if I remember correctly. I read it with a dear friend of mine, and the idea was that we would both read one book a month and include the relatively short epilogue as part of book 4, so we would finish the whole thing by late November. However, things don't always go according to plan, and that's perfectly okay. So I ended up finishing War and Peace a little later than I had originally planned and intended. But the reason I decided to read it over several months in the first place was because I wasn't reading it alone, so we needed a schedule, but also because my expectations about this book were wrong. They were so wrong. I thought War and Peace would be a lot more complex and rather difficult book to read because I had assumed that I would need to take a lot of notes and constantly refer to other sources to follow the plot. I was wrong. However, in preparation, and I don't regret this, I read a book entitled The Age of Revolution, Europe 1789-1848 by the late British historian Eric Hobsbawm, but I didn't even have to finish that book to get a good sense of how the Russian population would have experienced the Napoleonic Wars and the invasion. It is a good idea to have some notion of the history of the period before you start reading War and Peace, but I would say that you don't really need a deep knowledge of all the historical players and dates in order to enjoy War and Peace. Because for the most part, I found reading War and Peace absorbing, and I found myself reading for hours at a time, which means that if I hadn't set a schedule, I probably would have finished reading it in a lot less time and a lot sooner. Now, I'm not saying don't have a schedule because I am a fan of making reading plans, and I'm sure many of you are. And I think reading plans can be helpful, but I am also a fan of changing plans. And I think War and Peace is an easier and more enjoyable novel than most people who have not read it think it is. A word of warning though, do not expect to be dazzled from the very beginning. It might take you a little bit to get into the novel, but if you persevere, you will get into it fairly early on. At least I did. And when I did, I just couldn't stop reading it. More than a historical novel, however, I think War and Peace is a psychological novel. Tolstoy is writing about events that were still within living memory at the time he wrote it. And although some historical figures like Napoleon or Alexander I show up, Tolstoy is more concerned, I think, with his fictional characters and how they think and feel. So this novel doesn't have a hero or a clear protagonist, but it does have great major characters that evolve and change like people in real life evolve and change. Just be ready for those characters to challenge your expectations, sometimes disappoint you even. Also be ready to get bored at times. But if you are anything like me as a reader, you will power on through those boring bits in the hope that something brilliant will happen soon on the page. And if you do that, I promise you that brilliant things will happen before you know it and make the effort of going through this worth it. War and Peace deals with the big themes in life: why we're here, what is the purpose of life, and where are we going. Those universal themes continue to remain unanswered. They will never be answered. And all the great writers, and that includes Tolstoy, keep asking those questions. War and Peace is also a love story. It's about the choices people make and the mistakes they also make sometimes, but it is also about when people get things right. Also, money, particularly losing money, is an important theme in War and Peace. You know, I cannot think of anything that this novel is about that would still not be relevant to readers today. And that is why War and Peace has become a classic book. I feel that a lot of people are afraid of it, but I hope I can encourage at least some people to give it a chance with this video. And I hope you enjoy reading it as much as I did.